Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I thought we'd have a look at snare drums as opposed to vintage snare drums to modern snare drums. Which ones sound better? Should you own a vintage snare, or should you just forget about them and get yourself a modern snare drum? Or should you buy a modern snare drum that's designed on a vintage model? There's so many options for you out there. My answer to the first sort of question here is that should you own vintage snare drums or modern? Well, my opinion is you should own both. Another question I often get asked, do vintage snare drums sound better than modern drums? In many cases, yes they do. The downside, if there is a downside to vintage drums, a lot of the really old drums, a lot of their hardware, a lot of their snare strainers aren't as good as modern day versions. So let's have a look at this one for a start. This is a 1950 Slingerland Radio King. This snare strainer here is notorious for not working properly. I don't know why they persisted with this strainer for so many years. A lot of people have problems with them, and they tend to wear out, and especially in this mechanism here, this tends to come loose, and there's ways to fix that. A lot of people that don't really care about keeping the drum true to itself will actually take these strainers off, make up a little plate to bolt on a modern day strainer. So that's one thing that's not that good on vintage drums, is a lot of the hardware has got a lot to be desired, including old vintage drum kits. A lot of the tom holders, a lot of the stands, a lot of the like the bass drum spurs, a lot of them are really flimsy and not really don't really stand up to modern day playing. Now that said, however, there's something to be said for old piece of wood. The older the drum is, especially when it comes to a wooden drum, the wood tends to mature and get older, and it just gets this sound to it that's really hard to duplicate in a modern drum. That's one thing about a vintage snare drum that really is appealing, is there's no substitute for age, in a sense. So if you're prepared to put up with sometimes inferior hardware or inferior snare drum strainers, then vintage snare drums are a really good addition to your snare drum collection. Also, really too, it comes down to what style of music you're playing as well. If you're playing modern rock or funk type tunes, there's no point owning a 1940s snare drum. It just doesn't suit the era of or the style of music that you're playing. So having the right snare drum that suit the era of the style of music you're playing is important. This snare drum here, it's a modern snare drum. All the hardware, the lugs, the strainer, it all works really well. This is a Canopus one ply maple. I can get a reasonably vintage sound out of this without all of the dramas of weak hardware and parts. The downside is it's new wood. It's going to take a few years to really start to age and get that real warmth about it, but that's okay. This snare drum sounds a lot like the snare drums from the 60s. They made steam bent one ply. I know Slingerland made them. They were really good. In fact, I used to own a one ply Slingerland from the 60s era. It sounded beautiful. But this Canopus snare drum over here on the floor, it sounds as good. And as I said, I don't have the issues of all the old parts and hardware that can let me down on some of my gigs. So should you own a vintage? Well, the sound is great. If you want something a little bit more reliable, then I'd probably forget about vintage drums and actually go towards a modern drum. One that can actually give you a vintage sound, if that's the sound you're after, or if you're after a more rock sound like 70s, then drums, snare drums, and drums in general from the 70s, a lot of their hardware improved. Through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the hardware, in my opinion, a lot of it was rubbish. But by the 70s, they really start to get a handle on that. And of course, in the 70s, rock music came along and people were playing a lot harder. So they had to invent hardware to really suit, I suppose the abuse that the drums got during that period of time. So if you got a snare drum or a drum kit around from the 70s, it's probably the hardware is not going to let you down. And if you really want that authentic 70s rock sound, then buy a 70s drum kit. That said, too, I will say there's a real trend with a lot of the major drum makers these days. They're actually offering, lines, vintage style drum lines. I mainly play Gretsch drums because I love the sound of them. Their Gretsch broadcaster kit, which I have, you probably have seen it in other videos that I've made, especially in some of my little shorts. Go onto my short section and have a look at some of those videos. You'll see my broadcaster there. Broadcasters are basically like a reissue of a 1950s drum, but with better hardware. So that's the best of both worlds in a sense. That's one of the reasons why I own a broadcaster, is I love that vintage sound, but I want hardware that's reliable. So I bought a broadcaster. I also own a Gretsch Brooklyn kit. That is a more modern sounding kit. Put simply, the broadcaster has a very vintage bearing edge on the drums. They call it a reversed roundover. Most bearing edges on drums bevel in the drum. Broadcasters bevel out, and they offer a lot of head contact, and which then translates to a big warmer shell sound, and it's got that really traditional warm woody MIDI tone from the 50s. I love that. In a Brooklyn kit, they use a roundover 30 degree, but it's not like the broadcaster, so it has a much more modern sound to it. I would say it's got a 60s creeping up to 70s type sound. It still has that warm woody Gretsch tone, but they do sound a lot different. And all the brands, SNARE make a vintage series which is based on their very early kits as well. So there's a lot of, and I think Ludwig also make, I forget what they call it, but they make a maple and also a mahogany version of their, I can't remember actually what they were called, but it's a vintage line. So a lot of the major drum companies are actually making vintage lines because a lot of people love that big old warm woody tone. So you can get the best of both worlds if you actually buy one of those kits, a modern vintage style kit. Or, if you're not after that vintage sound, well, there's so many varieties of modern drums out there to choose from. Anyway, people, I want to keep this video short. Should you own vintage drum kit? Well, if you love the tone of it and you can put up with the hardware letting you down, well, by all means, go and grab yourself a vintage drum kit. If you like a vintage sound without the pain, then maybe look at one of the major builders that offers vintage lines. Or if you don't want any of that vintage sound, just getting something modern, well, there's 1,000 choices out there for you in the world. Anyway, people, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you like my videos, please take the time to subscribe to my channel. It takes 2 seconds to go click, and it's really appreciated and helps my channel grow. If you have a topic that you would like me to talk about in future videos, by all means, drop a message below. And tell all your drummer friends to come along and check out my YouTube channel and hopefully get them to subscribe as well. On that note, people, keep drumming, stay safe, be kind to yourself and other people, and we'll see you next video. Bye!